Hi, guys. It's Luke from Rower Academy, and I am very, very excited about the two gentlemen we have in studio with us today. David and Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
So, guys, thank you for taking your time to join us this evening. We're recording in the evening here, and I understand you guys just finished a long work day. So thank you for finding time in your workday to talk to us here. So let's just get right into it. So you both, or all the brothers for that matter, are graduates of Culver Academy, but you guys didn't start out as rowers at Culver. So could you speak to your experience to how you found rowing at Culver Academy?
So I'm the oldest brother, and I was class of 2011 for high school. So I was the first one to leave home. We're from San Diego, and Culver is a boarding school out in Indiana. And so I was class of 2011. Bryan was the class of 2013. And when I got there, I had always focused on swimming, and I always thought I was going to be a swimmer in college, and that was my goal and dream. And then Bryan got there, so that would have been 2009, and I was a junior, I believe.
Yeah.
And I'd always focused on swimming. I was a year-round swimmer, and it was a combination of Bryan, who had started rowing at home for SDRC, with my dad, who was a rower at Culver, both encouraging me to even just pick up rowing and row with Bryan for cross training, just for cross training for swimming. So I joined the team in the spring of my junior year.
And Bryan, you come into school, you're at school, your brother has found rowing yet in your freshman year, or he finds it later on? Because you guys both were swimmers and then made the transition, right?
Yeah, so I was a swimmer too. I think I stopped swimming a bit earlier than David. For me, I really liked the sport of swimming, but it was just kind of got a little burnt out on it through middle school, and was looking for a sport to kind of occupy my time. And that's when my dad was really encouraging about trying rowing. So I tried it out at home, kind of knowing that I'd be going to Culver for high school and that they had a strong rowing program there. So that's kind of what led me to rowing. And I think, it was a combination of trying to find a sport that, appealed to me, but also something that I could excel at. And I know for me, I tried a lot of sports that I didn't excel in, and swimming was a good sport, but it just, for me, there's something about rowing, being out on the water and outside, that was really appealing.
Sure. And so, I mean, I was a swimmer as well, so I can relate to this story, because for me, it was the same way. It was kind of being under the water, being isolated, having a black line at the bottom of the pool. Sometimes it's a blue line, but it turned out I was much more of a team sport kind of guy, and that really drew me into that. So as you guys found yourselves drifting towards rowing and drifting away from swimming, if you will, at what point were you starting to consider, hey, I'm pretty good at this, or I could be pretty good at this, and I'd be interested in rowing in college?
I think for me, it was a combination of, because I had been talking to some college coaches about swimming, and I always felt like being a D1 athlete was the ultimate goal for me. And I'd actually, Culver is a military boarding school, and so I was pretty focused on some aspect of the military, in that I thought that I was going to make that my college experience, and then, at a minimum, my experience thereafter for directly after college. And so I think that going into my senior year, it was a combination where I realized that I not only don't want to stare at whether it's a black, a blue, or a red line. I think I'd been swimming for 13 or 14 years, almost year round. And I never, I picked up water polo a little bit, but no one knew what water polo was in Indiana. and so it was a combination of me just really wanting something different. Rowing gave me that optionality of being that D1 athlete and achieving that goal that I wanted to do, while being able to go to a great school and get a great education.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Bryan, for you, how did you find yourself deciding this might be for me?
Yeah, I think, I kind of, when I started rowing, and especially once I got to Culver and rowed freshman year, for me, it was kind of my priority sport, I guess, so to speak. So I swam at Culver, but was definitely more focused on rowing. And I think freshman year, college is still a long ways away. So I think I kind of liked the idea of rowing in college, but, I didn't think about it much more than that. And for me, I think what was exciting was kind of rowing with David, especially my sophomore year, and seeing him get excited about the sport and go through the recruiting process over his gap year. And that's what really motivated me to want to row at a high level in college.
No, it's great. It's great that you said that, because we often talk with families that, when they go through the recruiting process with their first son or daughter, it's kind of, there's a learning curve there. But, when there's a second or even third sibling that then goes through the process, it's very advantageous, right? And so, David, in a lot of ways, you were kind of the pioneer in your family to pursue an Ivy League education and a D1, at a D1 rowing school. And you made an interesting choice in that you didn't exactly pursue that directly out of high school. And if I remember correctly, and correct me, you had gotten into school, had gotten into university, you had great options, but you made the decision to pursue a gap year. So, as Bryan alluded to, that gap year. And back then, we'll call it back then, it really wasn't that long ago, taking a gap year was, kind of this thing that was, not a lot of people did. But as it turns out, you did it. Bryan did it. Your youngest brother, George, did it with great success. So what led to making that decision? And then let's talk about the gap year that David, that you had, and the gap year that you had, Bryan.
Yeah. I think for me, it was identifying my senior year that I wanted to row in college. And it was through that also identifying that there are quite a few teams, but there's a lot of really good teams. And so it's just really trying to be able to, I felt like if I really committed to rowing, that I could go to, the beautiful thing about rowing is a lot of really good teams are at really good schools. Mm-hmm. And I really felt like that if I really committed myself and went all in, because I had swam through my senior year and I had really focused on, closing out just a really good swimming career. Mm-hmm. So I felt like if I went 110% and if I went all in on rowing, that I could really get into one of the top tier rowing schools and have that really unique experience. And I think that my senior year, when I looked at, the cup races at the Ivy League, the Cal Washington duel, it's that high level of competitiveness and that high level of racing and that high level of standard. That was what really attracted me to feeling confident in that, knowing that if I took the gap year and if I really committed myself, that I really felt like that I could get into one of those schools. And so I did take that risk, but then, fortunately I was able to talk to a couple of coaches and decided to move forward with you as my coach. And, through that, with your experience at Cal, you were able to educate me about that experience of rowing at a really elite level. And that was something that was really motivating for me, not just in the early stages of the gap year, that first couple of months where, we were going through the recruiting process. But once I made that commitment to Yale, thereafter, it's that strong commitment to working really hard so that you could come in day one and make an impact on the team.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And Bryan, your experience, I mean, your brother kind of paints the experience in the right way as the pioneer of the family and taking a risk. I feel anyone who takes a gap year, it could be considered a risk, right? It's one of those things where there are no certainties. And at a young age, it's very difficult to be 18 years old and think about in your mind putting something on hold, if you will, for a year, and there's sort of an insistence to get out of high school, get into university. And back in my day, 20 plus years ago, back in the late 90s, we had freshman rowing, and freshman rowing was great because it meant that anybody who comes to university was considered a freshman and rowed in the freshman division. And that meant even if you'd won under 23s and you were coming to university at 20 or 21 years old, or you'd won a medal at the World Championships or the Olympics, and then you decided to go to college, there was this barrier that existed. And in your time, with the freshman rule abolished, then anybody was eligible for the varsity in year one. So it became much more competitive, I feel, for you guys. And so do you think the gap year was something that helped you accept, okay, this is going to take a year longer than maybe I would like before I enter college, but it's going to put me in a better position in terms of developing myself and being ready for the rigors of what a D1 rowing program is now?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good question. And I think it was definitely a bit different for me taking a gap year than it was for David, just because he was already at Yale. And he was doing a great job on the team. The coaches were excited about him. To me, the idea of taking a gap year and doing kind of exactly what David did, just because it worked so well for him. Mm-hmm. And so I went through the recruiting process senior year, but realized that Yale was really where I wanted to be, and kind of what they were building there was super exciting to me. So I think in that sense, I was taking a year off, but I was excited to come back to San Diego for a bit and train with you, and then to row competitively after that before Yale. So I think for me, it was a pretty easy decision, just because the way it was presented to me my senior year was super exciting. But yes, I mean, I definitely think it helped tremendously having a year to prepare and an extra year to train. And I think part of that's the freshman rule, and it's also as more international rowers have come to the U.S. A lot of them come after a gap year or 2 gap years. So I think it's going to be more common for U.S. rowers to do the same.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. And so what advice would you offer young up and coming rowers who are very eager to graduate from high school and just get right out there? There are some youth rowers who develop pretty quickly, right? And the Clark Deans of the world, they polish up pretty quickly and become very, very fast. For those that are more on the bubble, they're maybe getting recruited to the schools that they want, but they're kind of at the back end of it, or maybe they're not quite getting recruited at the schools they want. What advice would you guys have, having done the gap year? I think we know the answer to this, but was it worth it? Is it worth it? Can it be, and is it a difference maker in the pursuit of academics and athletics in college?
Yeah, I would say to answer that question, I think the most important thing is to have an open mind. And like you said, everyone's at different stages, everyone has different goals. But I think as the gap year becomes more popular for U.S. collegiate rowing, I think it's important to have an open mind to it, and to look into it and talk to people who did take a gap year, and also talk to people who didn't and ask them why they didn't. And because I know at Yale, I ran into a few people, and just through rowing, people who were very opposed to taking a gap year. And once they got to sophomore and junior year, they thought, well, why didn't I take a gap year now? It would have been a great idea. So I think just kind of having an open mind and trying to learn more about it is the best way to approach that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you're making, because Bryan, you specifically, a gap year is not just sitting at home doing nothing. Gap years can be used in a variety of different ways. They can be used to continue to pursue standardized testing scores and improve that. They can be used to continue to pursue athletic ability. They can be used to have really terrific different experiences. Talk a little bit about rowing in England in the time that you were taking your gap year.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing experience. So I went there for about 4 months, and was able to row there on a team on the water competitively, compete at some regattas and then Henley. So something like that was really special. And that was kind of modeled after David rowing the summer at Penn AC before he went to Yale, which I think is also helpful. I just think it's good to get kind of on the water experience, as opposed to, obviously the ergs and weight training is so important, but you can't really replace rowing in a boat with other people. So it was a phenomenal experience and a lot of fun to live in England for a bit and get some work experience.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So, well, let's talk about, so you guys have your gap year, you successfully, navigate the recruiting process and gain the interest of different universities, and you both end up at Yale. And I think there are a lot of high school student athletes out there that are trying to figure out how hard is it, right? What is it studying and rowing in the Ivy League, and how did you find that balance, and what pitfalls would students want to avoid, and what sort of strategies did you guys come up with to manage your time effectively and balance the rigors of the academics and the athletics?
Like you said, it's striking that balance, and I think it's different for everyone. Mm-hmm. It's a serious challenge, right? But that's, a lot of the people that are rowing at a Division I level, they enjoy that type of challenge. I think a lot of it is about, really pursuing, doing the best that you can do both on the water and in the classroom. And that's, a lot of times is between practices, getting in front of your homework and getting in front of your schoolwork, knowing that, especially when it comes Thursday night, Friday night, like after a week of practices, you're really worn out and you're going to be going to bed by, if I remember right, like 10:30. And so it's being really diligent about your planning and knowing that, like, okay, if I have morning practices on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I can't schedule 9 a.m. classes and, that type of things. How you put together your class schedule, knowing that you need breaks throughout the week in order to get in front of your schoolwork. And it's just about, taking time on the weekends, taking time during your free time to stay in front of your work so that you don't get behind. But then also knowing too that people that are rowing in college, it's, especially at that level, it's, you're there to compete and you're there to contribute to a team to lead them to winning. And so it's about, putting in the time at practice and really being able to be rested enough and energetic enough to contribute at practice and to, put your best foot forward in the boat, on the erg, in the weight room, so that, you can really put in the work so that come race day, you're ready to perform and you're ready to beat the other boat that you lined up against.
Mm-hmm. Bryan, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I mean, I think rowing in college is, it kind of comes down to three things when you're studying and rowing in college. Is you kind of have your athletic life, you have your academic life, and you have your social life. And you can't focus 100% on all of them at the same time. Mm-hmm. So like you said, with balance, there's a lot of push and pull throughout the year and throughout the 4 years. And, ultimately you have to have priorities and you have to prioritize different things at different times. And you learn a lot from the guys around you, but you also learn as you go. And I think for me, what that came down to is it just makes the coaches so important. Mm-hmm. And having them understand that and having them support you kind of throughout those 4 years when you're just being pulled in a lot of different directions. And I know for me, I found throughout my time that, I definitely realized by my junior and senior year that kind of the most rewarding thing I was spending time doing was the rowing and really the work on the water. But I just think it's hard to force someone to understand that. And Steve's approach to kind of letting the athlete figure that out for themselves, I really, enjoyed, and I think I got a lot out of.
Yeah, we should probably touch on that. I mean, you were talking about kind of being pulled in different directions and really not in any competing ways, but I feel like just from the standards that are available, right? Yale makes no bones about it. Yale is an academic institution. You are there to learn. You are there to do the best you possibly can academically. Steve Gladstone makes no bones about it. You are there to win. You are there to row hard. You are there to become the best version of yourself as a rower. And so, I think it's great that despite that, both the academic side of the institution and the rowing side understand that they need each other, and that it's important that you're there for those two reasons, to be a student and an athlete. So let's touch on that a little bit, rowing for Steve. So, David, you are considered, I believe they call you guys the Phoenix class, of Yale. Or maybe that's something I made up. I don't know, whatever. You're like turning bright red. Who knows? I'm probably wrong about this.
No,
If
you're
there's anybody watching this from Yale, I got it wrong.
You're
You
right.
heard it first. I got it wrong. But you guys were there at part of this historic turnaround for Yale. And you were part of that. And David, you were at the front end of that. And Bryan, you were right in the thick of it. So what was that like? What was that experience like coming into Yale, experiencing the Steve Gladstone mandate of we're here to win? What was that like?
I think for me, it was, I still remember on my recruiting trip when him and I were riding in the launch together, and he was very deliberate about, he was just like, listen, Dave, like, we're building something here.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the right personality and the right mentality. And that was something that was really appealing to me. But it was also, the Steve Gladstone factor as well, as to, I had heard your stories about what he's like and his approaches to coaching. But, I think he takes a very, and this is after my time where I was at Yale and spent a lot of time with him, but he has a fascinating approach to coaching, and that, it is, like you said, it's all about rowing and it's all about winning. But a lot of it, the underlying motive that he has is he develops you, from young men into adults and into people that can contribute and really thrive and exceed in whatever they do, whether it's rowing at Yale, rowing after college, working after college, and whatever you decide to do. It's this mentality that he ingrains in the entire team about, this pursuit of excellence. And, and it's just from you'll remember at Cal, it's the same thing where it's like at Yale, it's just like, literally, you would just talk about it. He's like, I don't want you to stop watching your blade. It has to be perfect. Mm-hmm. You can't look away from watching your blade until you have a perfect catch. Mm-hmm. And it's those little things like that, in that he just pounded into your head every day. And it's this idea that when you come to practice, you drop everything and, you focus on rowing, because you have, school is part of your day, your friends is part of your day, and then rowing is part of your day. And when it's time for rowing, you compartmentalize and you focus, and that's your single focus. And I think that was something that, he had a fantastic approach to coaching that, he really was able to pull the best out of everyone. Mm-hmm. And he was a motivator. And I think everyone on the team really looked up to him because, first and foremost, he cared about all of his athletes. And it was, we always knew first, it's all about rowing, but, he would always just pull you aside. Hey, like, Dave, how's your history class going? How are your friends? Like, he would take the time to, yes, he comes off as all about rowing, but he is more about being about the athletes and his athletes. And he is completely invested in your life, not just in the 4 years where you row for him, but we talk on the phone quite a lot still to this day. And he checks in, and every time he checks in, even if it's gone for a few months, he'd be like, hey, Dave, like, how's your job doing in San Francisco? Mm-hmm. How's London been going? And, weren't you rowing for a bit? Like, he knows. And it's fascinating that of all of the athletes that he's coached over the years, that, he knows about them. He knows about their lives. He knows about their family. He knows about their siblings. Mm-hmm. And he asks. And, that to me was something really powerful that I noticed right away on my recruiting trip that it wasn't just, a cog in the machine where you row for Steve, you win him medals, and then you move on with your life. But you become part of the Steve Gladstone brotherhood. And it's not at Yale, but you become part of that experience of rowing for Steve and, being able to, like you and I do, tell funny stories about Steve and just, things that he says and his approaches to coaching that, still to this day, like now it's bringing, a massive smile to my face because it ends up being a true honor for you to be able to row for him and learn from him.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think Steve has a unbelievable ability to help shape young men into men, and he has an unbelievable ability to lead an entire squad, yet somehow segment it down to each individual component, each individual guy. Yeah. And he coaches everybody just a little bit different because he understands what motivates you. He understands what makes you tick. He understands how to get under your skin and get the most out of you. So I couldn't agree with that more. So David, you come in, you guys, it's all about buy-in. We always talk about buy-in and morale. Obviously your class bought in and carried the torch and carried that morale. Bryan, by the time you arrive, it's on the up and up, right? I mean, it's moving towards, the dominance that it's starting to show now. What is it like to show up into that environment, which, your brother could probably, David, you could probably argue that Bryan ended up in a tougher recruiting class because the classes just get better and better off the backs of the success of the guys that are turning around the program. So Bryan, what is it like to come in your freshman year in that class?
Yeah, definitely tough. Definitely tough. But I think, one of the things you realize going into collegiate rowing is in a different way than even kind of some other sports probably, it's just the level of effort that's expected is so different. And kind of the coach off in the boat and saying, like, what percent are you going? And you're like 80%. And you're like, that's your new zero. Yeah. That and just kind of fully kind of changing the way you think about taking hard strokes and really approaching every practice with intent, I think is one of the main things. I think it's hard to understand that when you're doing a sport just for a few months in high school compared to when you're doing it year round and you really have a goal. And even when you show up at practice in August, you have a goal that you're working towards that's in June. Mm-hmm. I think that whole mentality shift is pretty crazy, but it definitely takes some time to adjust to. But people do, and they kind of rise to the occasion and to the new level, and that's what it kind of people build upon each other, and that's what creates a winning environment.
Mm-hmm. And so would you guys, in the next topic, what we're moving towards now, I think that gives us pretty good insight into everything that's gone on leading up and through your education in rowing at Yale. I just titled this Rowing into the Real World. And what I mean by that is not only the academic skill set that you acquired at Yale, right? You guys went through some really serious academic rigors, and those rigors helped shape who you are as men and helped equip you with a skill set that you're now taking into the real world in your jobs. I think for our audience, I'd like to know a little bit more about what you guys are doing now and how you feel what you learned in a Steve Gladstone led environment, for example. What kind of skill sets are you taking from your rowing experience, from showing up with intent, from time management, balancing that, being goal oriented? How does that serve you guys now in your young professional careers?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been an interesting transition. Mm-hmm. It's been really fun, but right when you're rowing, there's the end in sight. Like Bryan was saying, you show up in August and you train really hard because IRAs is in June, the Yale Harvard race is in June, Eastern Sprints is in May. Like there's a defined timeline, and all right, if I continue to practice this hard, I know when the races are, I know when I get a break type of thing. It's a little different with work in that it's not as defined end objectives, but I think it's been a lot of fun as you transition out of school into the real world. I work in real estate, and I think a couple of things that I've really carried over is timeliness, and that it's like every athlete, you have practice schedule, you're on time, you're ready to rock and roll. But I think one thing that's been really beneficial to me is this attention to detail and this pursuit of perfection, and that like I had talked about earlier, it's you learn the hard way when you have Steve's launch riding along you, and he's just like, you're looking at your blade, he's like 99%, 99%, 98%, and it's just this like, and he's literally not going to stop until you hit it 100%, and you keep hitting 100% and 100% and 100%. And I think through that, where it's stressful, frustrating practices and situations like that you learn a lot about, carrying over that skill set into the workplace. But I think overall, it's about really working as a team and really being able to feel like, with rowing, and that there's 9 people in the boat, and that if one person is off, the entire boat is off. And, I think in terms of work, most people are on teams, and it's the idea of when you're given a task, it's this ingrained idea that if I don't get what I have to do done, then I'm letting down the other 3, the other 10, the other 20 people on my team. And so that's just something where it's kind of like a non-negotiable. You get it done because you can't let anyone else down. And you have that from rowing, and that it's like, I can't take a stroke off in a race because I have 8 other people in the boat that are depending on me.
Mm-hmm. And do you guys find that it's frustrating in the real world because you are assigned to projects and teams, and not everybody functions like a rower in the business world?
You can answer that.
Moving right along. Bryan, how do you find work in the real world?
Yeah, great question, Luke. Enjoying it, definitely an adjustment. I think, there's a ton of, cliches that are very true of how much being an athlete, and especially a college athlete, translates to success and work and in the real world. And I'll just touch on a couple of them because I think they're very relevant. But I think one of them is just focusing on an ability to focus on the small things. And that's something I learned a lot in rowing, of how important it is to kind of take practices seriously. As we were talking about practices months out of time, before races, taking them seriously and trying to improve every day, and kind of understanding, don't let a good practice get you too high. Don't let a bad practice get you so low. Just keep it on putting in the work. And I think kind of bringing that mentality to the office is really important to bring. And also I would add, I think that in college, there's not much that prepares you for the real world in terms of, hard deadlines, having to be specific places at a specific time, being expected to perform at a specific time. And, from erg tests to big races, to practice schedules, to practicing on the weekend, to having 2-a-days, and balancing that with school and with friends. I think it really does prepare you in a different way, so that there's not that much of a shock when you get to work and you're really expected to show up to work on time, and you're expected to reply to emails in a timely manner and things like that. Like, I just think the expectation gap, there's not really any of that, where I think for people coming out of college that aren't doing a sport, it's a bit more of a rude awakening of how the real world works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you guys are already offering, thank you for all of that, and for sharing how you transitioned out of the Ivy League and into the work world, and how rowing has supported that. I think it's important for a lot of young athletes out there to understand that their rowing experience in high school and their potential rowing experience in college has applications beyond high school and college rowing. And we talk a lot about the idea that there's no pro row. The furthest you can go is the Olympics, but there's not a professional league that exists after that, that you're going to make that's going to be your salary, right? You know, we're not pulling in millions or tens of millions a year like any of these professional sports athletes in football or baseball or basketball. So it's good to know that there is practical application in the skill sets that you guys have learned in your time that you're applying right away out of college in the positions that you're in. And so this is just a real easy segue into what advice do you guys have for aspiring student athletes that are in high school, maybe in a similar situation to yours? I'm in a different sport. I don't know if rowing's for me. Is rowing for me? How do they find their way there? Or, anything about, the things they can focus on now that might help them along the way to position themselves better to get to where they want to be. Because there'll be a lot of young athletes looking at you two going, well, I mean, they went to Yale. They rowed for Steve Gladstone at Yale. They must have done something right. So, what sort of advice do you have for aspiring high school athletes in their pursuit of the right fit and the right college?
I think that the underlying question of the piece of advice that I would give is do you have that passion? And college is not easy. It's challenging. There are a lot of days that are really tough, that really push you mentally and physically. And then you put on top of that schoolwork and a social life, and it's hard. And so you need to have that passion there that really, every day that you're waking up and you're excited about practice and you're excited about competing and you don't have to love rowing with, every ounce of your body, but it is, I think that, there's an aspect of, like MJ says, it's loving competing. And it's the idea that knowing that most practices at Yale, you line up side by side and you race. And like Bryan said, like, even if it's steady state, it isn't really steady state. Like it's, you do steady state, but you're also like, we were 2 lengths ahead, so we win the day. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's like the underlying motive is, that passion of, whether it is rowing, whether it is competing, but I think the underlying aspect is winning, in that, and being able to, right, because practices are long, practices are hard, and you have to have that end goal in mind, and you have to have that pursuit of winning in mind. And, I'd say that identifying that, but then also a lot of it is it's small steps. And like Bryan was talking about is taking each day in stride and knowing like, okay, today, we always talked about at Yale, and you always coached us too about it, where it's every day. It's not about like, I need to get from 6:20 to 6 minutes tomorrow through this practice. It's about, okay, if you want to get to 6 minutes, you want to get to 6 minutes 2 months from now. What are the small steps you're going to be taking to get there? And every single day, how can you get yourself closer to that end goal, right? And it's about, for us, it's we want to win sprints. We want to beat Harvard. We want to win Henley. Mm-hmm. And it's not about like every single day where because right, like you can't approach every single day where if you have a bad practice, it's like, well, that type of practice, you aren't going to win sprints. And so everyone loses their mind and gets mad. Mm-hmm. It's about every single day you have to build on yesterday. And it's the small incremental steps of, if you're going through the recruiting process of, did I get better today? Did I get faster today? Did I get smarter today? Did I move myself forward today? And sometimes even if you have a bad practice, if you have a bad day, that still has moved you forward because you know how to react to that. So I would say that that's the biggest piece of advice that I would give, not just, for rowing and the recruiting process, but then also, for everything that you do thereafter.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, passion is the double-edged sword, right? Passion is what gets you so positively fired up about rowing, and passion is also what can send you down on this roller coaster, down into this, dark spiral if you let it. So I really like how you're talking about, on one hand, you're talking about passion, but on the other hand, it's about tempering it with with consistency and making sure that you're not living and dying by every single result. So I think that's a great lesson. So Bryan, what thoughts do you have to add to that, or different thoughts you might have in terms of advice that you would offer any aspiring young athlete trying to navigate the process and end up with an experience like the two of you have had?
Yeah, definitely. I think first off, I would agree with David and you. Kind of what we've been talking about is just, approaching every day with intensity and real intent to get better, rather than looking at things months or years down the road. It's really about what can you do today and taking it a step at a time, and that's really how you get better. And once you're able to enjoy the process of it, that's really how you make significant gains. So I'd say, as far as like getting to a place where you can row in college, is a lot of that comes down to enjoying the process and working really hard on a daily basis. And then I would say, kind of as you think about rowing in college, at least for me, probably the most important thing with sticking with it and really enjoying it is the people. And I think that's the single most probably important thing when you're looking at different places where you want to row is the guys on the team and the coaches. And I know for me personally, like we say, there's a lot of highs and there's a lot of lows in rowing. And, it would have been hard for me probably to stick with it as long as I have, and to row for 9 years had I not worked with you in San Diego in high school, and then during my gap year, and then working with Steve and the coaches at Yale who I really created a bond with, and I felt like very excited to go and row for them, even in the bad times. And obviously the older guys, the guys in my class, the younger guys, as I say, rowing's the ultimate team sport. And there's a lot of days where you go out there and it's 30 degrees or something like that, and you have tests and all that, but you're doing it with these other people that are going to be your friends for life. And from that context, I think it's a really special experience, and I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. And I like that, because in the coaching that we do, oftentimes there are dark moments in high school trying to get your erg score down and trying to figure it out and trying to stick with it. And it's just a fact that not everybody who's rowing in high school is there for the same reason, right? There are athletes who are there who want to go on and row in college. There are other athletes who have found rowing because they enjoy it and it's something to do in high school. And there are yet other athletes still that are involved with rowing because mom and dad are forcing them to do it. And, I always try to remind, and Bryan, thank you for making this point. I try to remind athletes that in those harder moments, what they're working towards in high school is to be selected to be part of a hard charging, like-minded group of individuals. And they'll be around more people who are like them. And that's what they're working towards, is earning a spot on a team where they can be surrounded by people who are much more like them in terms of being goal-oriented and determined and positive and just resilient. And I think it's important to aspire to have that experience, to be around a group of hard charging young men if you're rowing for Steve at Yale, or hard charging young women if you're rowing at Texas with Dave O'Neill, or wherever. These are just examples. But it's those sorts of things that I think it's a good reminder for high schoolers to understand that's what they're aspiring towards. This is exactly what you've talked about. So guys, I don't want to take too much more of your time. I really appreciate you guys for being here. I think this will be very beneficial for anybody who is a young athlete who is interested in pursuing rowing. I think there are a lot of really good statements that have been made here, and suggestions and actionable items for athletes to consider as they move through this process. So thank you again. And for anyone watching out there, if you enjoyed this show, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them. This video will be on YouTube. We have a Rower Academy Instagram account at Rower Academy. Gentlemen, thanks again for your time, and we'll probably have you back on the show again. I'm very interested in having some future shows here and pooling more athletes, specifically those that I've worked with over the years. The Rower Academy graduates, we'll call it. But I'd be interested to see what similarities or differences all of you have had in your experience with Rower Academy. So again, guys, thanks so much for your time, and we will talk to you again very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Luke.